Well, hello again. Here's another question for the yes or no treatment, and it's about the Puritans. And the question is, were the Puritans a good thing? So what I'm going to examine here is whether or not the behavior and history of the organization, which certainly had a big impact both in England and America, was a net positive, really. Okay, well, let's go into a little bit of background. Much of this goes back to the origin, really, of the Church of England under Henry VIII, who, as we all know, in the 1530s, when he couldn't get his divorce approved by the papacy, decided that he would run the church himself, declared himself to be the head of the England, freed from the Pope. Now the Church of England was on its own, and it was a new era. It was the English Reformation. Well, quite quickly, what seemed to develop, both during the rest of Henry's reign, during that of his son Edward VI, and into the reign of certainly the Catholic Queen Mary, and even into the reign of Queen Elizabeth, were tensions between the Church of England as now constituted, the Catholic Church, which of course was to varying degrees rejected and discriminated against and abandoned by some, and the more fundamentalist group of members of the Church of England who thought that the Reformation hadn't gone far enough, that the Church of England was retaining too much of the past trappings of the Catholic Church, the old Christian Church, and they wanted to move much faster. We know, of course, of their history as people with kind of the funny hats that emigrated to America, founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony, ran a fairly austere, unfun-loving operation in New England, and the large numbers of them, and themselves were the ancestors of quite a few present-day Americans, especially in New England. We also know of the Puritans as the force behind the anti-establishment moves of Cromwell during the Commonwealth, and their role in really quite destructive behavior particularly in the churches, when a lot of windows were smashed, statues were pulled down, and so forth. So the Puritans, although they had their own fervent religious view, which some would think was a good thing, were controversial and at times, resorted to fairly unpleasant extremes of behavior. So let's take a look now at what the arguments are. Who were the people who would say the Puritans were a good thing? Yes, they were. Yes, they were. Okay, well, I guess the starting point is to decide whether or not, as a supporter of the Puritans, you agree with their view that the traditional trappings of the church, of the stained glass windows, the depiction of saints, the statues of saints, the singing of choral music in the big churches, in the robes and finery of the clergy, all of that sort of thing. You've got to decide whether or not you think that was a good thing. And for many who support the Puritans, they say it wasn't. The problem with all of that was that it really harkened back to the old days of an organization, of the Catholic Church in England and elsewhere, whom many seemed to think was corrupt, should be repudiated, was a self-serving organization that amassed wealth, often exploited the poor, etc., etc. So to take a more fundamental and austere, as it were, view of religion was a good thing, and therefore was a constructive move in the right direction, even though sometimes it was tough to accept the way it was done. Another very strong argument in support of the Puritans was their reverence for education and intellectual integrity. They viewed the idea of educating their youth as a fundamental necessity for the right life, for a moral view of the universe. And of course, in that sense, they were making sure that adherents to Puritanism were questioning the whole superstructure of religion and what should be believed and what shouldn't be believed. And that, of course, went absolutely against the traditional view of the old church, who even, burned people at the stake who tried to challenge teaching or to come up with a new translation of the Bible and so forth. So, to a great extent, the Puritans stood for intellectual integrity and intellectual freedom in a world that often turned its back on that, and which, of course, they saw as a very bad and immoral thing. So there's some pretty strong arguments now in favor of the Puritans and what they were up to. And when you think about the environment in which they lived, the atmosphere, one can almost sympathize with their taking a very hardline view in the other direction. Okay, well, that's the arguments in favor of Puritanism. Now, what about those who say no, Puritanism was not a good thing? Well, I guess to begin with, there was this idea, somewhat exaggerated perhaps, but nonetheless real, that they were against any sort of fun, any kind of social discourse, any way of being kind of part of the rest of the world. And in that sense, they're rejecting civilization. They're saying that all those other people who like to dance and to sing and to perform in theater and who like choral music in the cathedral, they're the sort of people we don't associate with. Well, what kind of person wants to be like that anyway? So that's one of the big objections, really, to Puritanism. Another one is the treatment of women, and particularly in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, it was made quite clear that not only were the men in charge of the family and of the religion, but women existed there in that community basically to serve the men and to do the ordinary distaff duties of managing the house and the children, and food preparation and so forth. But they were clearly number two, an idea, of course, that finds little favor nowadays and in fact provokes rage. The Puritans were involved in some pretty awful violent behavior in that they got themselves involved in witch burning. There was a strong belief among the Puritans that the devil was a very strong factor in people's lives and would, if allowed to go on unfettered, would drive people to extreme forms of behavior, and that had to be stamped out. In America, a fundamentalist preacher named Jonathan Edwards brought the devil into many of his sermons. And in fact, when you think about it, he was really going into the kind of behavior that had existed in the traditional church for centuries, which was using the fear of the devil and eternal damnation and so forth as a kind of a lever over people to frighten them into behaving and doing whatever the authorities said. So in that sense, it was a kind of a reversion to the traditional church, which of course is something they didn't want. At the same time, the Puritans had a very strong role during the incumbency of Oliver Cromwell, who took over after the beheading of Charles I, and became Lord Protector during the Commonwealth, which lasted from 1649 to 1660, and allowed, in fact, encouraged people to enter churches and smash up any form of religious imagery. I know here in Canterbury that many wonderful stained glass windows were destroyed. Even the effigies on tombs were smashed up, and faces obliterated, and so forth. And it became a kind of a thuggish enterprise on the part of the populace as a whole. And all of this was really being kind of driven by Puritan thought and sensibilities. And so, in that sense, if you love the idea of the art and history of these great churches, you have to question the behavior of the Puritans, because they were responsible for a lot of trouble. As a final comment on the actual doctrinal aspects of Puritanism, they believed in predestination. The idea that God had decided ahead of time, before you were born, who was going to heaven and who was going to hell. Now, it has always seemed to me that this makes no sense at all, because if it has already been decided which way you're going to go, then what kind of motivation is that to make sure that your behavior follows all of the rules? If it's already been decided, then that means you can't impact the decision, and therefore it doesn't make any difference how you behave. So I don't know how you square that circle, and in effect, I think that's kind of a pretty strong argument, really, against the logic of the Puritan theology. Okay, well, there we are. I think there are quite a few arguments against Puritans, not necessarily against their intellectual endeavors, but certainly against their destructive behavior. So what's my take? Well, I have to say that point exactly. While I do admire the great reverence for education and the great insistence upon intellectual integrity and on thinking about religion and not just blandly accepting what you're told by the priesthood, as so many religions do, to all of our detriment, I think. Nonetheless, it had really unpleasant aspects. The price that we paid for their behavior was fanaticism. And fanaticism of any sort in any religion, which basically implies that I'm the only one that has the right answer about God. All the rest of you are wrong. Therefore, you're morally inferior. And it's not too much of a step then to say, therefore, I ought to attack you or kill you or wage war against you or whatever. And that's the part that I really object to. So I have to say that despite some of the good things they did, I think we would have been a lot better off if they had never existed. Sorry, that's how I come out. So there you are. Probably a bit of controversy in that, but I do hope that you enjoyed it, and that you'll give me a like, a subscribe, hit the notification bell, and so forth, and I'll see you at the next one.